Hi everybody, Tony Muncy here. Tying a twisted bugger for you guys. A quick step-by-step tutorial. Really effective trout bass pattern. Steelhead if you wanted to. Reason I say that is you could up the gauge on your hook and tie it in any color you wanted. Black and blue, purple, pink, you name it. So we'll get after it. This here is a TP605 trout light predator hook from Ahrex in size 1. I personally like them in a 1 or a 1/0 for myself. That covers most of my trout and bass needs. You could tie them smaller. This is a large cone. You could tie it with a medium cone as well and just have a slightly smaller hook. So, and a slightly overall smaller fly. That said though, your schlappen, you'd have to downsize the length of the fibers on it a little bit to create a smaller profile and maybe a smaller chenille as well. Otherwise, it'll look roughly the same. So start out, we take some 030 lead and I put about 7 wraps that I will shove behind that cone eye. I do 7 because about 4 of them get tucked, 3 of them show, and gives me something to tie off. So I'll take a pair of pliers and I shove it back behind that cone. So no need for glue, no need for thread wraps up front. This and the final wraps of chenille and schlappen will hold this puppy in there really good, the cone that is. All right. I take my first thread wraps and what I'm doing is trapping that tag of lead and then I will create a ball of thread right behind it. That keeps it from moving. You can twist the cone, but you can't move it. So that's step number 1. Then we'll work our thread back. If you have a rotary vise, like this Nor vise here, this fly goes really quickly. If you have a stationary vise, not as fast, but I'll show you some tricks to make it a little easier on you. So first step with the tail, a couple things I like to do with any of my streamers that include marabou is I'll strip this fluff off of the base and I will go in and come down about the length of my tail, okay? And cut out the quill at that point. So I'm making a V cut. This one's really, really fluffy, but as you can see, possibly. There we go. The tip is cut out. And why I do that on both of the plumes is I'm not losing much, number 1. And number 2, when I tie that tail in, it's going to look pretty much the same, and I'm going to get more undulation and more movement without that quill. No matter how fine it is, or no matter how flimsy it seems, when you put it in the water, it will in fact be a better swimming fly. So I tie my tails on these roughly the same length as the overall hook. I tie it in and I take my first quill towards you, so away from me, and I spin my quill. It kind of pulls everything together. I pinch it and I tie it off on the camera side, so on your side. And what I'm trying to do here with these 2 tail plumes is build up the body to roughly the same thickness as the lead wraps. So as you'll see when I get done with this, it'll be roughly the same diameter. Is it super crucial on something like this? Not at all. Just aesthetically and building a strong body, a good foundation for that. The complex twist body is what I'm trying to do here. So I'm going to do that once more with another marabou plume. Something I like to pick out is, as you can see, I had a hard time holding it straight up. I like a plume that's not super fine, but not super, super bushy either. Just right in between. And I choose 2 of them that roughly look the same. And I put the second right on top of the first. So nothing on either side, just right on top of it. Line up the tips Do a few securing wraps. And there's our tail. Then I wrap up again, and then on my side, so you as the tire side, I spin the quill, pinch, and secure that. So it kind of rolled away from me, but the idea is to keep it as close to you as the tire as possible. Kind of keeps it even. All right. And we're going to trim our excess here. So there's our tail. Super fluffy, moves great in the water. If you've ever seen one of these in one of my swim tank videos in person or online, they just move. They're super awesome. 2 plumes. If I was going to do a 2-tone tail on a bigger hook, I might use 2 light plumes of each color, so 4 total. In this case, I'll just use the 2. And next we use Krystal Flash to match your color. In this case, I'm doing olive, so I like either a peacock olive or like this mixed color that kind of has some orange, yellow, red, and primarily green is kind of what color you pick up off of it. I picked 3 of those out. That's what I use as my tail flash. So if you were tying white with that pearlescent UV Estaz, you could use the UV Pearl, I think is what it's called, the Krystal Flash, or one of the whites. If you were tying yellow, you could use gold, green. I like copper or green. Brown, I like their, I'm trying to think of what it is, medium brown Krystal Flash, or gold or copper. You know, you match that flash in the tail with the color of body and hackle and tail that you're using. So I'm going to show you a little technique for tying in Krystal Flash. I start with my thread right at the base of that tail. I'm going to turn my vise here so hopefully you can see this a little bit better, but I'm going to lay them right on the side. So exactly the length of those marabou tail feathers. I'm going to give 2 or 3 securing wraps. I might have to kind of adjust the strands here because it's a little awkward at this angle. Okay, I'm going to lay them right on that side. I'm going to make 1 wrap forward, about 1/8 of an inch. Okay, so you're going to have kind of a gap between where these 2 are. That's on purpose. I'm going to move my vise back here real quick. Diagonally away from you on the other side, you're going to lay those Krystal Flash fibers away from you. This is for the other side. And to get them to lay perfectly on that side, a technique is, while we wrapped forward 1 wrap, is because when I wrap back, I will inherently trap those Krystal Flash fibers pretty much right where I want them, as you can see. So instead of making a loop around here or you know, trying to trap it and then it ends up on top or on bottom, that's all you have to do. And it works pretty much every time. It's just an extra couple thread wraps. Then I trim them, same length as the tail goes, and there's your Krystal Flash. So super effective way to do it. Hope that makes sense. But basically tying in that first side, coming forward about 1/8 of an inch, coming diagonally away from you, outward, and then come back. And when it traps, it'll lay it on that side. Cool way of doing it. So our body material is Estaz. So as most of you tires know, Estaz comes in pretty much every color that you can imagine, which makes it perfect for this. And reason being is with this one, I personally like this, kind of has a peacock undertone. It's black, but it has green accents. That kind of gives the body some depth when you're looking into, see if I can show you here. It might not focus, but it's a little darker in there, and it builds up that body nicely. I use about an 8-inch strand of it. You'll be surprised at how much of this you use. And if you didn't want to go through so much material, you could space out your wraps a little bit more. That would work as well. And I just tie it in by the tip. And for this particular fly, I lay it away from me. So on the side away from me is where I put my Estaz. My complex twist schlappen and UV Polar Chenille will be on this side, and I'll show you the reason for that here in just a sec. Okay. So for this fly, I use two schlappen feathers. One of them I try to have slightly longer. That's your body hackle, part of your complex twist. And the other I choose because it has longer feather fibers, and that's going to be our collar. So in this case, this is a pretty good example. I want to leave a few of the feathers, feather fibers that have kind of that marabou-y tip to them, but the rest of this plumage, about to right there, I just strip off. Makes good damsel tails. You know, don't waste it if you have a use for it. But for this pattern here, I like to keep them out of there. This isn't a super long schlappen feather, so we're probably only going to get about 4 wraps out of it, but that's okay. Run my fingers down, exposing the last ½ inch or so of the feather. And on my side here, we're going to tie that in. And most of you know this, but all feathers have like a top and a bottom, or a good side and a bad side, what have you, whatever you want to call it. I'm sure there actually is a name for it, but I want that up. In this case, the good side. Okay, so the underside, if you will be pointed down. And the next part to this complex twist is UV Polar Chenille and UV copper. And we want, it's probably maybe about 6 inches, and basically the same length as the overall schlappen feather, including the quill, because I'm going to wrap a couple more wraps of the UV Polar Chenille than I am the hackle. So show you how I do that. Tie it in by the tip as well. And real quick, when you're tying this in, you'll notice that any UV Polar Chenille it goes one direction. Okay, so I want it pointing down. So if you can kind of see that, the fibers point down. I'm going to tie it in at the tip. It doesn't wrap as good when you do it the other way. And I've been asked when tying this fly before why I don't incorporate the Estaz in the complex twist, and the reason is because when you see what kind of body the Estaz when it's tightly wrapped back to back, what it gives me. And what it gives me is a more shapely body, and gives something that the complex twist of the UV Polar Chenille and the schlappen can bury down in. And each time I make a wrap, say every 3/16 or 1/4 of an inch, however long your hook is, the dubbing ball, if you will, of Estaz behind that wrap allows to have more breathability, I guess, of the fly. And when I've incorporated the Estaz into into the complex twist, I don't like the way the feather fibers from the schlappen or the UV Polar Chenille lays. So I wrap up my Estaz first, and then I do my complex twist, and that's the reason why. So I'm going to get my schlappen out of the way. If you have a rotary vise, this would be a good time to wrap your thread forward, throw a ½ inch in, and get your thread out of the way. If you do not have one, the technique that I use personally is kind of like palmering a hackle, and that's basically, as I come over the top, I use my fingers to brush those feather fibers back so that each wrap I'm not trapping a bunch of the fibers. If you have a rotary vise, then you can go forward and then brush out whatever might be clumped in when you're done. Now, the biggest thing I will say on this pattern is I try not to overcrowd this cone. I will wrap just close enough to it that you don't see a big gap behind it, but there is a little gap. That's going to allow for the tie off of your UV Polar Chenille as well as your schlappen, and to wrap 4 to 6 wraps of your schlappen collar behind that. So we want just enough. Go in, tie that off. Cut off your excess. And then what I like to do, some of you know this, some of you don't. One of the best tools that I have next to maybe my bobbin and a pair of scissors is these brushes that I make out of old maple gym floors and some of the loop side of Velcro. And I taper one end down, as you might be able to see here. And these are just perfect to brush out that Estaz. We want as much of that sticking up as possible, and we want it sticking up and down as much as possible before we wrap up our complex twist, so that basically each wrap is going down into that body as much as possible. I'm going to throw in a half hitch here, get my thread out of the way. Now here's the trick for the schlappen. Number one, I didn't explain why I have my Estaz over on this side and this on this side. It's just to keep the materials separate and not tangled, and you're not trapping the other materials when you wrap the Estaz forward. So it just makes it easy to come around for that first wrap, trap your schlappen and the UV Polar Chenille, and continue forward. Now, some people put these in a dubbing loop, per se, or a clamp style dubbing loop like Loon makes, or homemade ones, and spin it. I don't really feel that to be super necessary. What we're trying to do, and I'm going to do it real quick and then I'll explain what you should be able to see, is I want to make it so that these overlap or twist about 6 times. So I'll make it till I see about 6 turns. I hope you can see that. Let me see here. It's pretty close. You're seeing about 6 turns in here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, roughly. And take my brush again. I just brush that out. You made a brush here, is essentially what you've done. Okay, so that looks awesome. You're getting that nice mix of the schlappen, the long fibers of schlappen, and equally in length, roughly, is your Polar Chenille, and it just looks awesome. So on all of these, as you'll come to find, I use the UV copper on every single color combination I make. Sometimes I'll use the silver on white, and that's about it. Otherwise, I use this UV copper. So I make one wrap, kind of pull some of these fibers backwards here like you're wrapping a hackle, behind the Estaz and over the tail. And I make my first wrap fairly close to that. So you can wet your fingers here, try to get it to lay to one side. If you're not using a rotary vise, you don't really need to do that. You would just make each wrap more precise and pull back those fibers. If you have a rotary vise, I tend to do this, and I'll hold it up and try to kind of angle those fibers back just a little bit. And I make about 4 wraps. I try to make that feather last right to the very end, like that. Finish that. Then I hold on to my UV Polar Chenille back here with a clip, just for a sec, and I tie off that schlappen right behind the cone. And that ended up perfect. So if you could see that, I'm trying to make that feather last the entire fly length, the hook length. And then I'll wrap an additional about 2 wraps of the UV Polar Chenille right behind the eye. And tie that off. So if the camera will show it, we still have a little bit of a, not a gap, but just a valley right behind the cone and those materials. That's going to be a perfect amount of space to wrap that collar in there, and without overcrowding it or creating kind of a mess. All right. So this is where the brush comes in handy. If you were to look in there, you'll see some of that Estaz is pinched or laid down, as well as some of our complex twist wraps. I'm going to throw a half inch in here, and this is where you go a little crazy with your brush. That's why I make them out of maple. And this Velcro is they're impossible to break. They're super, super sturdy. Message me for details if you haven't seen them before. I think I have a tutorial video. If not, I explain them a little bit more. And I'll try to get one to you if I have any. And I get in there. So don't be worried about ruining your hackle. This is a kind of a chaotic looking streamer. it in there. The idea is that we fluff it up as much as possible, that body at least, and the rest of it will lay back just fine. We want to expose as much of that hackle as possible. We want to expose the body as much as possible, the Estaz body. And that's about how I want it to look. All right. Okay, so for the collar, we're not going to use as much as we did for the complex twist, but I do want the longest fibers possible without getting the marabou-like stuff in there. And I usually do 4 to 6 wraps, so I'll probably tie in about right there. It's usually about 2.5 inches. It just really depends on the feather. And I tie it in by the tip. I'll do 3 wraps behind the tip. I'll pull that back, and I'll do an additional 3 or 4 wraps. I leave that tip in. The reason being is a lot of times people will pluck this tip, and I will remove it. I'm just, for now, I wrap and then I pluck it off. What that prevents is wasting a feather, or potentially wasting a feather, because it pulls out or snaps, and I think it creates a stronger tie-in. So how I do this is palmer the hackle forward, right behind that cone. Pay attention to your wrap. Sometimes you might even need to fold your hackle. It kind of depends on how it lays and how thick your quill is. I tend to do this part by hand rather than rotary. It's kind of that finishing touch on the fly, and I want it to look even and nice. Then I come behind and I tie off that quill. Give it a little pull. I'm gonna check something here. If you can see on that off side, there we go, that should be better. I'm gonna finish it about right there. We're starting to get a little too bulky. Okay, try that again. Come behind, once, twice, pull all the fibers back, about four turns, and do however you like to finish off a fly. Oh, I think I might have trapped some of that schlappen, and that's okay. So trim off your thread, and now we're going to come in. Here's your tip. Pluck that. There's your quill. Oop. And brush that hackle back. Got a little thick on the quill there, maybe a little too many wraps, but still, that's a general step-by-step of the twisted bugger. This is one of my favorite trout flies. You got a little flash in the tail, tons of movement. When you cut out that quill on those 2 plumes, you'd be surprised on any woolly bugger, any tail you do, that extra little 5-second step gives you a lot more undulation, a lot more movement. You have all of this flash and UV qualities in your body in that complex twist, and you have a nice collar of schlappen here. Kind of builds up this nice, blocky shoulder, so you could fish this in still water applications as well as river. Not the most identical imitation, but in a green, dark green or brown, it could be a good sculpin imitation as well, just by the movement of it and the bulkiness up front. I have fished them in rivers before with success. In lakes, the nice thing about this pattern is with the UV qualities, up near the surface it's not going to do you any good, but down deep with a purple or black pattern, you're going to have those UV properties that really do you some good, as well as the numerous color combinations and solid colors that you can tie this in. You know, having them all in a still water box, you just can't go wrong with it. So, and the materials are readily available. We can get Krystal Flash at almost any retailer. Schlappen, obviously, or if you can't find schlappen, strung Chinese hackle packs are readily available. Estaz or some type of a chenille, readily available, and then Polar Chenille or something like it will do just fine. The steps remain the same. I hope it works out for you guys, and I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Be sure to like and subscribe if you did, and as well as check out my Instagram at Muncy Designs. That's where I post most of my pictures and links to videos as well. So don't miss out. We'll talk to you later. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.